If I had known what was about to unfold that afternoon, I might have chosen a different cafe. But my sister and I just wanted a quiet moment, a simple refuge tucked between a florist and a dusty old bookstore. The cafe had always been our favorite, the steady hum of espresso machines, soft indie music floating in the air, and the comfort of familiar faces bent over their cups. She was the quieter one between us, my little sister. Always had been. She sat curled up with her usual vanilla chai latte, a fantasy novel clutched in her hands, the cover bright with a golden dragon mid-flight. Books were her shield against the world, her escape hatch from a life that hadn't always been kind to people like her, soft-spoken, sensitive, a little different. I was halfway through my own lukewarm coffee, mindlessly scrolling my phone, when the bell over the door clanged, not the usual soft jingle, but a sharp, almost warning clang that made me look up. And that's when she walked in. The woman practically vibrated with hostility. Short blonde bob, oversized sunglasses despite the cloudy day, a knockoff designer bag slung over her shoulder like armor. Her face twisted in a sneer the moment she crossed the threshold, as if the very air offended her. She marched to the counter, her voice slicing through the cafe's gentle murmur. "Why is the music so depressing in here? Can't you play something normal?" she snapped, loud enough for the entire room to hear. The barista, a college kid with the resigned look of someone who'd seen it all, gave a polite, practiced smile. He explained the playlist was hand-picked by the owner. She scoffed, muttered something sharp under her breath, and ordered a large oat milk latte in a tone that made it sound like she was filing a complaint. I tried to ignore her. Cafes attract all sorts: stressed students, sleepy parents, the occasional self-proclaimed queen of entitlement. My sister didn't even glance up from her book. But the woman, who I would soon only think of as Karen, wasn't content to stew at the counter. No, she prowled. She prowled like a lioness itching for a fight, her eyes darting from table to table, face twisting in visible disapproval. I felt it the moment her gaze locked onto us. The stare hit me like a spotlight, sharp, invasive, accusing. When I finally lifted my head, our eyes met. Something passed between us, a subtle calculation on her part, and then, she shifted her full attention to my sister. My sister, blissfully unaware, turned another page, lost in her fantasy world. Karen approached, each click of her heels against the wooden floor sounding like a ticking bomb. She stopped right beside our table, arms crossed, coffee cup dangling precariously from her hand. Without even addressing us directly, she announced loudly into the air, "What's wrong with her?" My sister startled, the spell of her book shattered. "Excuse me?" I said sharply, heart pounding. Karen tilted her head, scrutinizing my sister as if she were a stain on the furniture. "Her vibe is weird. It's giving me bad energy. Is she okay? Like mentally?" I clenched my fists under the table, forcing myself to stay calm. "She's reading a book," I said coolly. "She's not bothering anyone." But my sister was already shrinking into her seat, fingers trembling as she turned another page she clearly wasn't reading anymore. Karen scoffed, rolling her eyes dramatically. "Well, maybe she shouldn't stare so much. Some of us are sensitive to that kind of energy." She said energy, like she had just discovered the word on a self-help blog and decided it made her superior. Before I could answer, I heard chairs scrape against the floor nearby. Two men stood up from a table a few feet away, men I hadn't really noticed before. Middle-aged, plain clothes, the kind of faces you could walk past without a second thought, except there was something about the way they moved. Quiet. Certain. Unmistakable authority. One of them stepped closer and spoke, his voice cutting through the tension like a cold blade. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to stop harassing these patrons." Karen blinked, visibly thrown off. "And who exactly are you?" she snapped, trying to summon that earlier arrogance. The man smiled thinly and, with a single fluid motion, flipped out a badge. "Detective Roman. Off duty, but still within my jurisdiction." The cafe fell dead silent. He spoke calmly, clearly, as if explaining something she should have already known. "You approached a young woman, insulted her unprovoked, and are now disturbing the peace." Karen opened and closed her mouth, floundering for words. But she was staring at me, she barked. The second detective, taller, arms crossed, added with slow disdain. And your response to that was to confront her? In a public place? Loudly? The barista behind the counter nodded almost imperceptibly, and a low murmur of agreement stirred among the other customers. Karen bristled, face flushing with rage and something else, fear maybe, and before anyone could react, she lifted her cup and hurled the contents straight at my sister. The world seemed to slow. The steaming coffee arced through the air like some horrible comet, and all I could do was watch as it collided with my sister's shoulder. She screamed, a sharp, broken sound, and stumbled backward, her book crashing to the floor. I was on my feet in an instant, blood roaring in my ears. But the detectives were faster. The calm atmosphere of the cafe shattered into chaos, gasps, the scrape of chairs, the clatter of dropped mugs, as everything unraveled. And Karen. Karen had just crossed a line she couldn't uncross. The second the hot coffee hit my sister's shoulder, the entire cafe seemed to jolt awake. The low buzz of conversation snapped into sharp gasps, silverware clattered to the floor, chairs scraped violently as people lurched back. I reached for her instinctively, panic crackling through me like electricity. The front of her hoodie was soaked, the light gray fabric now stained dark and steaming. She whimpered, clutching her shoulder, her face twisted in pain and shock. The detectives moved so fast it was almost a blur. That's assault, Detective Roman barked, his voice slicing through the rising noise. You're done. Karen stood there frozen, her empty cup still clutched in her hand like a weapon she hadn't realized she'd used. She blinked, confused, as if she hadn't expected consequences, as if the coffee was supposed to erase us instead of make her accountable. It was just coffee, she barked, trying to sound indignant, but the wobble in her voice gave her away. I have a right to defend my peace. Defend your peace? I stared at her, barely able to comprehend the absurdity. She wasn't defending anything, she had attacked an innocent girl sitting quietly with a book. The taller detective stepped forward, pulling out a pair of handcuffs with a smooth, practiced motion. You just assaulted a minor, he said calmly. With hot liquid. That's attempted bodily harm. Karen stumbled backward, bumping into a nearby chair. You can't arrest me, she shouted, her voice teetering on the edge of hysteria. She was staring at me weird. Around us, the other customers remained frozen, some whispering, some wide-eyed, no one moving to support her. Because there was nothing left to defend. The detectives moved in, swift and clinical. One wrenched the empty cup from her hand, while the other grabbed her wrists, snapping the handcuffs into place. The sharp click echoed across the cafe. Karen stiffened, mouth opening and closing soundlessly like a fish yanked out of water. I barely spared her a glance. My focus was completely on my sister, who was now shaking violently, the hot drink burning her skin, humiliation burning even deeper. The cafe's staff sprang into action then. The barista leapt over the counter with a clean stack of napkins, and someone from a nearby table handed me a bottle of water. You're okay, I whispered over and over, dabbing at her soaked hoodie, trying to soothe her trembling. Her skin at the base of her neck was bright red, angry and raw. She flinched every time I touched her, even gently. My heart shattered a little more with each wince. The paramedics arrived minutes later, ushered in by the frantic barista who had dialed 911 as soon as the cup flew. One of them, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and steady hands, crouched beside my sister. Superficial burns, she said after a quick examination. Painful, but treatable. Cool compress now, and we'll monitor it. They offered to transport her to the hospital, but my sister shook her head immediately, biting her lip to keep from crying harder. She just wanted to go home. I understood that all too well. Meanwhile, Karen, still cuffed, still furious, was squawking at the responding officers, spinning wild excuses about bad energy and provocation, her words tumbling over each other in a pathetic attempt to rewrite reality. No one was buying it. Not the barista, who quietly handed over the security footage. Not the customers, who were already lining up to give their statements. And certainly not the officers, who had heard every desperate lie under the sun and were unmoved. As Karen was escorted out, still struggling, still snapping hollow threats about lawyers and lawsuits, a thick silence settled over the cafe. The doors swung closed behind her with a heavy thud. It was like a spell broke, like the weight of her presence lifted and the world could breathe again. The cafe manager approached us with 2 fresh drinks and an apology he didn't owe but offered anyway. "We're so sorry," he said, wringing his hands. "We've never had anything like this happen before." I nodded, the words catching somewhere in my throat. The adrenaline was draining now, leaving exhaustion in its wake, a heavy, aching kind of tiredness that clung to my bones. Detective Roman returned a few minutes later, his calm presence a strange comfort amidst the chaos. He handed me his card, his voice low and steady. "If you need anything," he said, "please call. We'll be filing charges. She won't get away with this." I tucked the card into my pocket, feeling its weight like a promise. My sister, still holding the cool compress to her neck, didn't speak. But she didn't need to. Her wide, tear-filled eyes said it all. She had been attacked. Humiliated. Hurt. And for once, finally, the world wasn't looking away. As we left the cafe, the midday sun glared down on the sidewalk, casting long, sharp shadows. I wrapped my arm around her shoulders and led her toward the car. One slow, careful step at a time. We weren't broken. Not today. Not by someone like Karen. We spent the rest of that day wrapped in a strange, heavy silence. At home, my sister curled up on the couch under her favorite blanket, the cold compress still pressed gently against her neck. She didn't reach for her book, didn't even turn on the TV. She just sat there, small and quiet, lost inside herself. I hovered nearby, pretending to scroll through my laptop, ordering her favorite takeout without asking, refilling her water glass when she wasn't looking. I didn't know what else to do. I just knew I had to stay close. She didn't speak until the sky outside turned the deep, bruised color of evening. "I didn't even look at her," she said suddenly, her voice barely louder than a whisper. I set my laptop aside immediately and turned toward her. "I believe you," I said simply. And I meant it with everything in me. She stared down at her hands, twisting the edge of the blanket between trembling fingers. "But she said my vibe was off. Like I was making her uncomfortable just by sitting there." The words fell between us like sharp stones, jagged and impossible to ignore. I felt a wave of helpless rage surge inside me, not just for what Karen had done, but for what she tried to plant inside my sister's heart. Doubt. Shame. That poisonous whisper that maybe, somehow, she deserved it. "You did nothing wrong," I said firmly, reaching out to gently squeeze her hand. "Some people hate what they don't understand. They lash out because they're too small to see past their own fear." She didn't reply, but she leaned against me, her head resting lightly on my shoulder. And that small act, that simple, silent trust, meant more than any words could have. We stayed like that for a long time. No TV, no distractions. Just breathing. Healing. The following Monday, my phone buzzed with a call from an unfamiliar number. I hesitated a second before answering, but when I heard the calm, steady voice on the other end, a wave of relief washed over me. Detective Roman. He explained that the police were officially moving forward with charges against Karen, misdemeanor assault, public disturbance, and possibly the most serious, attempted bodily harm, depending on the severity of the burn and how the judge viewed the case. She posted bail, he added, but we have plenty of witness statements, and the cafe's security footage. It's solid. Solid. The word felt like an anchor in a storm. When I hung up and explained it all to my sister, she stared at me in stunned disbelief. "They're really taking it seriously?" she asked, her voice thin with disbelief. "They are," I said. "You're not invisible. Not this time." 2 days later, we visited the local police station to give our formal statements. The building was old, the walls faded from too many years of fluorescent lights and whispered secrets. It smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant, a strangely grounding combination. Detective Roman met us at the front desk and guided us into a small, windowless room where a simple recording device sat waiting. My sister went first. She was nervous at first, her hands trembling slightly as she took the oath. But once she started speaking, the words came like a slow river, steady, unstoppable. She described everything with a quiet, heartbreaking clarity. The way Karen had approached, the way she mocked her, the shock of the hot coffee exploding against her skin. She didn't dramatize it. She didn't try to win pity. She just told the truth. And somehow, that was more powerful than any speech could have been. When she finished, the room fell silent. Detective Roman nodded with visible respect. "You did good," he said simply. "You were honest. That's what matters." I gave my own statement after, filling in the gaps, describing how Karen had stalked around the cafe, how she had escalated without warning, how the detectives had intervened even before the coffee flew. When it was done, Detective Roman assured us that the case was strong. Karen had hired a lawyer, apparently, one of those local commercials you see at 2 in the morning, all flashy suits and empty promises. But Roman was confident. Between the footage, the medical report, and the witness statements, Karen didn't have much of a defense. As we left the station, I noticed something subtle about my sister. She walked a little taller. Her shoulders weren't hunched the way they had been. She wasn't completely healed, not yet, but she had faced something terrifying and hadn't been broken by it. That mattered. More than any court verdict ever could. That night, we sat on our tiny balcony with mugs of lukewarm tea in our hands. No hot drinks for a while, not yet. The night air was cool and smelled faintly of rain. "I still can't believe she got arrested mid-sip," my sister said suddenly, a small, wry smile tugging at her mouth. I laughed, a real laugh, one that felt like it shook some of the pain loose. "Right? Cuffed while holding her coffee like she was starring in some bad reality show." We both laughed quietly, and for the first time since that awful day, the tightness around my heart loosened just a little. Justice wasn't about making Karen hurt. It was about making sure my sister knew she mattered. Her pain mattered. And no one, not even someone like Karen, could take that away from her. The courthouse felt colder than I expected. Not the kind of cold that comes from air conditioning, but something heavier, the chill of old floors, old walls, and too many heavy stories soaked into the wood. We sat side by side on a hard wooden bench, my sister nervously twisting a tissue in her hands. She stared straight ahead, eyes fixed on nothing, her breath coming in shallow, uneven pulls. I kept my hand near hers. Not forcing, not crowding, just there. In case she needed it. When the doors opened, and Karen walked in, the air seemed to thicken. She looked different now. Gone was the blustering, raging woman who had hurled a latte at my sister. In her place was someone buttoned up in a stiff, ill-fitting black blazer, her hair scraped back into a bun so tight it looked painful. But no matter how polished she tried to appear, she couldn't scrub the bitterness off her face. She sat across from us at the defense table, avoiding our eyes. Her lawyer, a rumpled man who looked like he lived off cheap coffee and missed deadlines, muttered to her under his breath. She nodded stiffly, a puppet desperate to get the script right. I watched her for a moment, not with hate exactly, but with a distant, almost clinical detachment. This was the woman who thought she could hurt my sister and walk away without consequence. Not today. When the judge entered, the room rose, then sat with a heavy thud. The judge was an older woman with silver hair pulled into a low bun, her presence commanding without a single raised voice. You could tell she didn't tolerate nonsense, and she didn't have time for games. "State of California versus Karen Mitchell," she announced crisply, flipping open the folder on her bench. Karen's lawyer entered the expected plea of not guilty, but I heard the hesitance in his voice. Even he knew this case wasn't built to be won. The prosecution started cleanly. No theatrics. No dramatics. Just the facts. Karen had, without provocation, approached a young woman sitting quietly, insulted her publicly, and then thrown hot liquid at her in a crowded cafe, all in full view of multiple witnesses, including 2 off-duty detectives. Simple. Devastating. The first to testify was Detective Roman. He moved with that same calm authority he'd shown in the cafe, his voice firm but measured. He described the events with clinical precision: Karen's aggressive approach, the verbal harassment, the moment the coffee was thrown. Karen's lawyer tried to rattle him, tried to suggest that Roman being off-duty somehow weakened his credibility. The judge shut it down almost immediately. "Witnessing an assault," she said coolly, "does not require a badge." Next came the barista, the young man who had been behind the counter that day, his hands shaking slightly as he recounted everything he saw. Then another customer. And another. Each voice layered over the last, a slow, relentless building of truth. When my sister was called, she hesitated only for a moment before walking to the stand. She was pale, but steady. Her voice, small, soft, carried across the room as she recounted the horror of that afternoon. How Karen had loomed over her, how she had mocked her for simply existing, and how, without warning, she had hurled the burning drink at her. She didn't cry. She didn't break down. She just spoke the truth, and somehow, that made it all the more powerful. Karen's lawyer tried to chip away at her testimony, suggesting that maybe my sister's energy had been perceived as threatening. It was a cruel tactic, grasping at nothing, and my sister, God bless her, responded without flinching. "I was reading a book," she said simply. "I didn't even know she was there until she started yelling at me." The judge scribbled something down without looking up, her expression giving away nothing. But I saw the slight dip of her chin, a silent signal that she'd heard, and she'd understood. Finally, Karen herself took the stand. It was a disaster. She rambled about feeling spiritually threatened, about bad vibes, about needing to defend her personal space. She tried to cast herself as the victim, claiming she had been emotionally overwhelmed and had acted instinctively. But every word she spoke dug her hole deeper. When she insisted that it wasn't that hot, the prosecution calmly entered the paramedics' report into evidence, the one that described the first-degree burns on my sister's neck. Karen's face crumpled for a split second, then a tiny, flickering crack in the mask. But it was too late. When closing arguments wrapped, the judge announced she would review the evidence and return a verdict in 2 days. We were free to leave. As we stood and gathered our things, I caught a glimpse of Karen out of the corner of my eye. She didn't look at us. Didn't meet our gaze. There was no defiance left. Only something hollow and trembling, something she couldn't cover with a stiff blazer or rehearsed speeches. Outside, my sister let out a long breath, not relief exactly, but something close. It wasn't over yet. But for the first time, it felt like we were standing on the side of the light. And no amount of Karen's darkness could pull us back in. When we returned to the courthouse 2 days later, something was different. It wasn't the walls, or the stiff benches, or the sharp smell of old paper and polished floors. It was us. My sister walked beside me with her shoulders back, chin lifted just enough to show she wasn't afraid anymore. Not of the building. Not of the memories. Not even of Karen. The faint pink scar on her neck was just visible beneath the collar of her soft blue sweater, a small, stubborn reminder of everything she had endured. But she didn't hide it. She didn't hide herself. Karen entered a few minutes after us, looking smaller than I had ever seen her. The stiff blazer, the heavy makeup, the tight bun, none of it could disguise the frantic, restless way her eyes darted around the room. She didn't look at us. She didn't look at anyone. When the judge appeared, the room rose, then fell back into solemn silence. There were no speeches this time, no drawn-out arguments. Just the facts. Just the truth. The judge opened the file in front of her, scanning briefly, her expression unreadable. "The court has reviewed all evidence and testimony," she said, her voice steady and final. "In the matter of the State of California versus Karen Mitchell, this court finds the defendant guilty of misdemeanor assault and attempted bodily harm." There was a beat of pure, ringing silence, like the whole world had paused to hear those words land. The judge continued without missing a step. Ms. Mitchell is sentenced to 100 hours of community service, mandatory enrollment in an anger management program to be completed within 90 days, and payment of a $5,000 fine to the state. Additionally, restitution in the amount of $2,500 will be paid to the victim for medical costs and emotional distress. She set the folder down, her gaze locking onto Karen with the kind of force that stripped away every excuse. Let this be clear. Aggression masquerading as entitlement is still aggression. Assault cannot be excused by discomfort. Actions have consequences. The gavel struck the bench, one sharp, echoing crack that seemed to vibrate through the walls themselves. It was done. Karen didn't move. Didn't speak. Didn't cry. She just sat there, stiff and hollow, as though her body hadn't caught up to what had just happened. Her lawyer leaned in to whisper something, but she didn't react. And honestly, I didn't care anymore. This wasn't about her. This was about my sister, about what she survived, about what she reclaimed. As we stood to leave, I turned to her, ready to offer words, some kind of comfort. But I stopped when I saw the look on her face. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was peace. Outside the courthouse, the sky was a soft, hazy gray, the kind that feels like the world is waiting for something better just beyond the clouds. We walked to the car in silence, but it wasn't the heavy silence of trauma anymore. It was the quiet of survival, of resilience. At the curb, my sister turned to me, a small, real smile tugging at her mouth. I didn't think I'd feel anything, she said softly. But I do. Not revenge. Just lighter. Like I don't have to carry it anymore. I nodded, feeling something unstick in my own chest, something that had been lodged there since that awful day in the cafe. You don't, I said simply. You never did. The next few weeks passed gently. The burn on her neck faded, becoming just a faint scar, barely visible, like a whisper of the pain she had endured. She returned to her favorite cafe, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. She read her books again, sometimes laughing out loud at a ridiculous plot twist, sometimes crying quietly over a beautiful ending. She was still herself, still quiet, still soft, still different in all the best ways. But there was something new in her now too. A steadiness. A knowledge that she had faced cruelty, and refused to be defined by it. As for Karen, we heard through the grapevine that she had started her court-ordered community service, cleaning public parks, restocking food banks, picking up trash along highways. Whether she learned anything from it was none of our concern. She was no longer the main character in our story. She was just a footnote. Sometimes, the world tries to tell quiet people that they are easy targets. That their softness is weakness. That their silence makes them invisible. But that day in the cafe, and every day after, the world, through the voices of strangers, the calm authority of detectives, the clear verdict of a judge, answered back. Loud. Clear. Unshakable. You matter. You are seen. You deserve to be safe. And no one, not even a Karen armed with a cup of scalding anger, could ever take that away again.